You're listening to Digi City, a cyberpunk story in 10 parts, written by Jarrett Rush and produced by SciFi Serials.com in cooperation with the author. Part 10. Polls. Miller was back in Digi City, walking the perimeter. He let the people pass by and studied their faces. But this time he wasn't looking for Roma. He didn't need a picture. He already had the face he was looking for memorized. Chris. Somehow the people passing weren't freaks anymore. Overnight, they stopped being the enemy. These were just people. People drawn in by the hard pull of digital and squandering the lives gifted to them. Miller knew that he could be one of them, and his heart ached for the wasted potential. He pushed deeper into the crowd, stopping at a light pole that was filled with posters and faces. What was written on each was unique, but the message was the same. Help me find my loved one. The truth was heavy in Miller's chest. He looked across the courtyard to another pole a few dozen feet away. It was also filled with posters. The same was true for a pole in the other direction. Cruz had lied to him. It wasn't just Miller and a couple of other agents out tracking down the runners. There were too many posters of too many kids for it to be a small group at Roma. Miller wanted to take all of them down and start contacting these families and friends and tell them the truth. Roma had killed your son or daughter or friend. But he didn't. He walked away. This wasn't his problem now. The only thing he had to do is find Chris. Data-addled addicts bumped into Miller as they stumbled their way to wherever it was they spent their days. Maybe on a bench at a park somewhere. Maybe passed out in an alley after drinking a six-pack of Roma's finest. Chris had gone on long data jags before. He'd spend every day for weeks plugged in and spend his nights sleeping wherever he was when his body gave out. That's what Miller assumed was happening now, that Chris was in the middle of a bender, and at some point, he'd hit bottom. That's when he'd come back home to Miller and Carrie and Hope. Then Miller could sit him down and have the kinds of conversations he should have had years ago when it became clear that Chris was hooked on data, should have had conversations that Miller had played out in his head every night as he hunted down runners. At some point, you have to let him live his life, let him make his own choices. That's what Carrie had told him, variations of it multiple times. And Miller knew she was right, but she'd written Chris off years ago. Miller couldn't yet. Not until he felt like he'd done all he could. He'd exhausted all of his effort. Miller pushed deeper into the crowd, still scanning faces. He focused a little harder on anyone who might bear a resemblance to Chris, and that's when he saw him. A few dozen feet ahead, his face on a poster, on a pole.